Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Critique of Modern Systems.
It's great to be back. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. And I'm really ready for this one. We're getting into a concept today that is, well, it's so important for understanding why societies get stuck. But there's just no single good English word for it. We're talking about Vasat.
That's right. And the analysis here, it goes so much deeper than just, mediocrity. That word doesn't even come close.
Not at all.
When we talk about Vasat, we're really diagnosing a kind of a deep-seated pathology, a state of stagnation.
Right. So our mission here, for everyone listening, is to really dig into the mechanisms.
Yeah.
How do these complex societies with these incredibly rich histories get trapped in what the source calls an idle mode, a Rölanti?
Exactly. Stuck in neutral, despite having every reason and resource to move forward. And this isn't an accident. We're talking about a deliberate process of decay.
That's the key distinction, isn't it? Idle mode versus just accidental failure. So let's start with the word itself, because originally it meant something.
Good.
Right?
Completely. In its original untainted sense, Vasat just means average. Or no, you could even say moderate.
So like balance.
Precisely. A healthy society, a sustainable population is balanced around the average. That was the goal. It was a positive thing to be Vasat.
So when did that flip? When did average become this corrosive problem we call Vasatlik?
It flips when you apply that same idea of average to the demands of the modern world. That's when it becomes toxic. Vasatluk is this state where all the key functions of a society, I'm talking about intellect, technology, democracy, politics, wealth, they're all stuck in that idle mode.
Just burning fuel but going nowhere?
Going nowhere. It's a collective agreement to perform far below what the times demand. And that acceptance, that is what leads to surumim, to corrosion, to systemic rot.
It's a decision to be insufficient, but the source material also brings up this internal conflict, right?
Yeah.
Something inside us that fights against just being average.
Oh, absolutely. That's the psychological core of it. The human spirit, the nefs, is basically programmed to push boundaries, to want more. It hates being ordinary.
It's what drives innovation.
It drives everything, every leap forward in history. And so the real struggle, the conflict of Vasatluk, is a society trying to manage that, this deep desire to achieve something great versus the comfort and safety of just staying in idle mode.
And the systems in place end up rewarding the ordinary, so the desire for greatness just gets dampened.
And gets suffocated.
Yeah.
Now, focusing on the specific societies in this analysis, what makes them so vulnerable to this decay beyond just, general human nature?
There seem to be two really key cultural factors at play.
There are. The first one is what's described as a migratory spirit, a Gosman Biruha Sahib Olma.
Which isn't just about being nomadic, right?
No, it's more of a psychological rootlessness that creates a mindset where you feel like you can just move on from a problem instead of doing the hard work to fix the underlying structure.
And the second factor?
That one might be even more powerful. It's this strange, almost reflexive ability to be persuaded by the ordinary, to just accept it, to become hemhal with the mundane. Normalizing a substandard reality becomes a survival skill.
And that tendency gets supercharged by this immense weight of history they're carrying. I mean, we're talking about a culture that is constantly referencing the glory days of past empires.
The 16 of them, if you follow the popular narrative. And that obsession with past strength, it completely poisons the present.
How so?
And it leads to what we could call a state of pacifization, a collective passivity. Because the past was so great, the present always feels like a disappointment. So instead of inspiring you to act, it just makes you wait.
Wait for what?
For a savior, a kutarichi. Everyone is just looking for that one genius artist or a brilliant leader who will magically restore the past glory, all without anyone in the present having to do any of the actual difficult work.
It really is the ultimate family business trap.
It's the perfect analogy. The founder builds this incredible thing from nothing, taking huge risks. But by the third or fourth generation, what do you have?
You have managers, not founders.
Exactly. They're great at maintenance. They keep the lights on. But they have none of that founding spirit. They're just passive successors, waiting for some new person or some outside force to come and innovate for them.
And in a Vasat society, everyone is just waiting for the founder to return.
Which means you can't even define yourself by your own achievements. You end up with this postmodern identity crisis where you say you're an academic, but something's missing. Or too much. You hide in those labels because real, complex achievement is too hard.
So that's the historical backdrop. But how does this mediocrity actually operate? How does it defend itself now, in the present? The analysis says it's basically post-truth.
It is. It doesn't just lie about reality. It actively bends it, twists it, plays with it until the truth just becomes irrelevant.
And its main tool for doing that is simulation. The term used is simulative.
Right. And what that means is you take a really substantial concept. Let's say strategy.
Okay.
A real strategy involves deep planning, risk analysis, ethics. But under the simulative process, you empty that word out completely. Then you arbitrarily refill it with something simple and immediate.
Like our strategy is just to oppose the other side.
Exactly. Or our strategy is to get more likes. The depth is just gone.
Sure.
And what's left is a hollow shell that everyone agrees to pretend is real. This allows words like democracy or justice to be used without any real conviction behind them.
And this hollow consensus is maintained by manufacturing conflict, this idea of neuropolitics.
Yes. Vasat thrives on false antagonism. It knows our brains like easy categories. Us versus them, good versus bad.
Put that can wait.
It exploits that by creating these rigid boundaries where none really exist. The example given is perfect. This insistence that conservative must be the polar opposite of secular.
When in reality, they're not mutually exclusive at all.
Of course not. You could be personally conservative while believing in secular law. But Vasat forces this zero-sum game because it prevents nuance, it prevents complex alliances, and most importantly, it prevents complex solutions.
We see that simplification play out in culture and art, too. It just degrades everything into a kind of parody.
Absolutely. The lines between high and low art just disappear. The deepest human qualities, love, conscience, mercy, they get reduced to these performative behaviors you can capture in a 30-second video for instant emotional payoff.
And if your culture can no longer express depth, the collective mind just loses the ability to even think deeply.
And you see it so clearly in the religious discussion mentioned. The whole focus shifts away from, profound philosophical questions.
Right. It's no longer about ethics or fuck.
No. Instead, it all becomes about trivial things. What breaks my fast? These tiny logistical questions, the huge transformative questions about a meaningful life, are just ignored. And important figures are just turned into, quote, machines for social media, whether the quotes are accurate or not.
So if the whole system is built on this simulation, it has to be rooted in hypocrisy, inikeuslik, operating in this constant gray area.
That gray area is where the collective complacency lives.
Yeah.
And we saw the danger of that in that award ceremony controversy.
Right. An organization gives this major honor to a public figure who has a known history of violence against women.
And they do it on a day specifically meant to promote women's social standing. The timing was just unbelievable.
It's a perfect case study of how Vasat in action works.
It is, because the key takeaway isn't just that they gave him the award. It's that society was perfectly fine with this person being a primetime cultural and economic force for years.
Nobody said anything then.
Exactly. Everyone benefited from his status. The outrage only happened when the high-profile honor created this public clash of meanings that you just couldn't ignore anymore. It was a selective, convenient outrage.
Which points to this time blindness that's part of the Vasat environment. The crisis didn't happen because the facts changed, but because the timing created a contradiction.
A contradiction the system could no longer sweep into that gray area.
Right.
And then you see the crisis management, which was just pure Vasat playbook. The sponsors tried to distance themselves.
We just gave the money. We didn't have any control.
Which is a completely meaningless claim in the modern world. Sponsorship is influence. It is control. To claim you have no responsibility for the people you financially empower, that is the absolute peak of denying your role in that gray area.
And the consequences of living in that state of denial are, well, they're measurable, aren't they? When you look at the global metrics, the cost of Vasat becomes really clear.
It does. You see this society ranking shockingly high on the global misery index. We're talking up there with countries in active conflict or total collapse.
Sudan, Venezuela, the comparison is staggering.
But here's the thing. The economic misery, the inflation, those are just the symptoms. The analysis makes a very strong case that the real root problem is the hematocephalate.
Mental misery.
Mental misery. A spiritual and intellectual poverty that comes first, and then it infects everything else. The economy, politics, art.
And that poverty, that mental atrophy, is actively enforced by the cultural gatekeepers themselves, the TV producers, the editors.
All of whom operate on this single, deeply manipulative assumption. Hokalamior. The public won't understand.
That one phrase just kills any chance for complexity.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Because if you believe the public can't handle complexity, what do? You systematically dumb everything down, you demand short sentences, you ban complex words.
You think you're making things accessible.
But what you're actually doing is reinforcing the cycle of mediocrity. You are training your audience not to expect or demand anything better. You create the intellectually impoverished audience you claim to be serving.
I want to end on a point that really pushes back against that low expectation mindset. The analysis completely refutes that old European categorization of these people as just nomadic or Gurser.
Yes, and this is so important. That label has often been used to imply they were primitive or rootless, which is just historically false.
What was the react?
The reality is that these were settled civilizations. They had the complex infrastructure needed for seasonal movement, like the system of moving between the mountains and the high pastures, the Yalis. That requires incredible planning and a deep, established culture.
So to accept the nomad label.
Is to accept a low, externally imposed definition of yourself. It's a core tenet of Vasat. It's a denial of your own historical complexity.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Vasat isn't just about being bad at something. It is the corrosive, collective surrender to standards that are far, far below your true capacity. And it's driven by this deep historical passivity and by cultural systems that actively manipulate what we think is possible.
And overcoming it, well, it takes more than just economic policy. It demands a kind of intellectual bravery. It means we have to systematically dismantle this mental misery by challenging the very people who profit from the idea that the public can't understand.
And that's the question we'll leave you with. If knowledge and complexity are constantly framed as things the average person can't handle, who really benefits when we all believe that depth is something to be avoided?